and we pick up at the two dots on Yud Aleph Amud Bet, where it's so we had a whole important discussion yesterday about the about whether making a fast day for a personal religious pursuit is considered a good thing or a bad thing. And again, that raises the interesting issues of the relationship, as I've been talking about the Yachid to the Tzibur, because there you are separating yourself from the Tzibur, not, as the Gemara discussed earlier, by indulging in pleasure when the Tzibur is B'tzar, but if, accepting upon yourself Tsar when the Tzibur is going about its normal business. And is that necessarily a good thing or a bad thing? Is an important question. It's a very different type of a Taanit than the Taanit that the Gemara here is dealing with, or the Masechet deals with, which is a Taanit specifically in the communal context and in the context for rain. Anyway, now we move on to the next section of the Mishnah, which is Ochlin V'Shosi Mishech HaShecha, about a third of the way down on Yud Aleph Amud Bet, that on these minor, when the process of fasting begins, it starts first with the Yechidim, with the individuals, and then if it gets to Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and it still hasn't rained, then it becomes a communal fast, but either the individuals or the communal is of the lighter nature, because you can eat eat and drink the previous night, and the other types of things are not forbidden, like anointing and bathing and sex and so on. Okay, so that's true about the first three of the individuals, and then the first three of the tzibur. So the Gemara says like this: Amar Rab Zeira Amar Rav Huna Yachid shekibel alav Taanit afilu achav shata kol halayla lemachahu mitpalel tfilat Taanit. So the first statement is pretty straightforward, based on the Mishnah, that if an individual accepts upon himself a Taanit, so either you're one of these Yechidim, and you're doing it in the context of rain, or you're just doing it for your own purposes, like the Gemara discussed yesterday. That there's a track that's not related to the rain, but you're accepting a private fast. So, and you eat the night before, because as we've seen in our Mishnah, so certainly the fasts of the Yechidim that begin is one that they eat the night before. So, you're still considered to be observing a Taanit, and you say the Tfilat Taanit the next morning. You say in the Shmona Esrei, because it's still a Taanit, even though it's only starting in the day and it doesn't include the night before. Yes, it also says, I don't even understand the Chiddush. I mean, the Mishnah says that that's considered the first three Taanit for the Yachid and the first three for the Tzibur. If it's considered the basic statutory Taanit, of course you meet Palal Tfilat Taanit. So probably there's not much of a Chiddush in that, but now we get on to the next point. And then it says, Lan beta'anito, in a way it's maybe said as a contrast, to say, so if you sleep in your Taanit, meaning now it's Motzei, your fast day, and you didn't eat. Let's consider, like, if we'll use one of our examples of a historical fast, it's the night after Shivasar B'Tammuz. So you ate the whole night leading into Shivasar B'Tammuz, and come the day of Shivasar B'Tammuz, you're considered to be B'Tanis, and you say Aneinu. Then comes the night of Shivasar B'Tammuz, and you don't have dinner that night, and you wake up the next morning, so you still haven't eaten, and now you haven't eaten for like a full 24 hours, right? Lan B'Tanito, Einamit Palo Shel Te'anit, comes Shachris of the 18th of Tammuz, you don't say Aneinu, you don't say, because even though you're still fasting, and here you've been fasting for the prior 24 hours, so it's a contrast. In the one case, you ate 10 minutes ago, you ate before Amud HaShachar, and comes Shachris, and you say Aneinu. Here, you haven't eaten for the last 24 hours, but you don't say Aneinu. You know why? Because you have not accepted it as a Taanit. It's true you haven't eaten, but because you have not accepted it as a Taanit from the day before, as we're going to see, it doesn't have the status of a Taanit. So that's the reason he says probably the first statement as well, is to create the contrast. Yes, Charlie.
In our Shitur, individuals don't say the Aneinu during Shachar.
Okay, I'll talk about when we say Aneinu in a minute, okay? But anyway, that's his point, okay? So in one case, you ate mamish an hour before and you're B'Tanit because you accepted it from the day before. And in the other case, he doesn't say that's the reason, but I'm putting that out there as the reason. And the other day, you fasted for 24 hours and you're not saying Tanit.
Rabbi Linzer?
Yes.
So Rashi seems to make the point that night, Motzei the Tanit,
yeah,
So you don't eat kolot or layla l'shem ta'anit. In other words, he still has the kavanah to be in the
Right, so that
fast.
could be as well. You could be doing it not just that you forgot to eat, but you could even intentionally be fasting, but it's not officially a Taanit. You have not accepted. We don't know, but we'll assume that that's the reason, that you haven't accepted it starting the day before. But let's see now how the Gemara unpacks it.
Another way you could look at it,
Yeah.
that is that the Gemara is rejecting the possibility that you're still engaged in the Shivas or Tammuz fast until you eat. And you keep saying Anenu until that fast, that you have completed that fast.
Right. Meaning, so it's meaning.
As long as you haven't eaten anything since the
Right.
beginning of an official time.
Right. You
You're
would.
still in that fast.
Right.
You still keep
You mean so
saying
that
Anenu.
part of the Chiddush is not just that this isn't. So what you're saying is part of the Chiddush is not just this doesn't count as a new Taanit, the part of the Chiddush is it doesn't count as a continuation of the old one. That's true as well. Yeah, both of those are true. Okay, so that's definitely a Chiddush. So let's see what the Gemara says. Amar Rav Yosef, let's see how the Gemara unpacks it. My Kasavar Rav Huna, what is Rav Huna called? Svirale, Ein Mitanin L'Sha'ot, Odilma Mitanin L'Sha'ot, V'Mitaneh L'Sha'ot, Ein Mitfal Tfilat Ta'anit. So he says, I'm going to consider this continued fasting the night following and the beginning of the next morning as a ta'anit sha'ot, for hours. Now, why exactly it's considered for hours? Every time you're in the morning of a fast, you've only fasted a few hours. You haven't finished yet. But again, presumably, since you haven't accepted it from the day before, and, it's also not clear. Let's maybe even say maybe it's not even your intention to finish the fast. Maybe it's only your intention to go through the morning and then you're going to have breakfast after Shacharis. So either because you didn't accept the whole day as a fast, again, what's the problem is not spelled out here, or because you're not intentionally planning on fasting the whole day. It's called a Ta'anit Sha'ot. It's only for hours. It's not the whole unit of the day. So that's how he identifies what's different about this case. And therefore, I want to understand what he holds. Does he hold that Ein Mitanim L'Sha'ot, that it's not considered a fasting at all? That even if you were, if you wanted to, let's say, eat right now, but, you could eat. There's no sense of being in a fast if you're only planning, if you either haven't accepted it the day before or you're only planning on doing it as part of the day. It's not a full day fast. It has no status at all. And you can go ahead and eat if you want to. There's no sense of violating any fast. Or, Dilma, no, there is some status of a part day fast, and you would be considered to have fasted half the day. But it's not enough. It's not enough to say Anenu. Anenu is for a full day fast, but there still is some status. So the nafkamin of these two is like, number one, am I allowed to just go ahead and start eating when I want to? Is there a sense that I'm in the middle of a part day fast that has some binding quality? Okay, maybe there's some other nafkamin. If I accept it upon myself to fast a certain number of days, can this maybe count towards a fast? Okay, but that's the question. Is there some weight to this as a part day fast? But certainly not enough to say Anenu. So the Gemara says, Amalei Abaye, so Abaye said back, La'olam kasav Rav Huna. Rav Huna really holds mitanim l'sha'ot, v'mitaneh l'sha'ot mitpalel tfilat ta'anit. Actually, he holds that it has a full weight. You can have a half day fast, and if you fast for a half day, you would say Anenu. So let's say you say, I'm going to fast until noon. I'm not going to have any breakfast. I'm going to fast till noon. So you're bound by that fast, and during Shacharis, you'd say Anenu. So why is this any different? Okay, so because, and here again, that's why the Gemara was ambiguous what the problem was. Here it spells it out. The problem is that you're planning on eating after Shacharis. So you're planning on eating for lunch. The problem here was, the weakness of it was that you were not mekabel the fast from the previous night. And therefore, it does not have the weight. So this is going to be two factors of a ta'anit that the Gemara is going to sort of be moving back and forth about. Number one is the need to be mekabel at the previous night, to give it the weight that's binding. It's not just I happen not to be eating, but it has the status of a fast. And again, this is all by yachid, by the tzibor, it's gozrim, It's just decreed that this is the ta'anit tzibor. It's not about my individual acceptance. And the other is the fact that if it's part day or a full day, it's like the guy says, I'm fasting between snacks, right? So how long do you have to be fasting to give it that significance of a ta'anit? So those are the two factors, the duration and the Kabbalah. So the Gemara here says the problem is not that you're planning on eating after Shacharis, you're planning on eating after lunch. The problem here is that it lacked the Kabbalah. But presumably if you were Mekabel, a half-day fast, that would be binding on you, and you would say Anenu. So that's where the Gemara is right now about the nature of this and why it wasn't a ta'anit. I should say, by the way, just to answer the issue of Anenu, right, Tosfos raises the question about when do we say Anenu when we do our fast, and he quotes the Bahag, who says, if you take a look at the end of Tosfos Lan B'Ta'anito, he says like this. 1 minute. So he says it like about 10 lines after the Tosfos Lan starts, the line that starts with the word achal, he says, umefaresh bihochot gedolot, right? Halachot gedolot, thank you. The eino mimanenu b'tfilat shacharit, shemanim sa shakran b'tfilato, the shemalo yisayim hatanit. Right, that's our practice, that the individual doesn't say Anenu because you might not complete the fast. The linira, the lo nikra shakran, kivan chayibedato litanot, afilu ikri ones achakach, velo mati litzayer nafshe. He says, I don't understand. Even if something happened when it was shachris, you were planning on fasting the whole day, so why shouldn't you be able to say Anenu? And then if you skip to the bottom, Tosfos says like this, because of, 1 minute. Okay, v'nohagim, it's 5 lines from the bottom, last word on the line. V'nohagim sheshliach tzibor omro b'shacharit, kedei l'hodia la'olam l'hazkir hatanit. So what the shliach tzibor says in Shachar is to make it clear to everybody that there is a fast day going on today. Avol yachid eino omer ad hamincha. But the individual only says that the mincha following the practice of the Bahag, except we have the Shliach Tzibor saying it at the beginning. Right, I understand, but that's the practice. Anyway, the interesting quotes the Torah Chaim, which obviously is a later insertion into Tosfos. Okay, so anyway, all right, but that's actually how we get to our saying of Anenu. The Gemara, it's not clear. The Gemara, presumably, you were saying it at Shacharis. Yes.
Okay, just to note, the Sephardic practice is for all the Yechidim to say Anenu.
At Shacharit.
Yes.
Okay, good to know.
Okay. The Kabbalah from the night before, must that be a verbal Kabbalah?
Okay, so we'll talk about that. That's coming up later in the daf. We should the Kabbalah. Yeah.
I was just say it's interesting that Tosfot assumes that you're going to start that the Shliach Tzibor is going to remind everybody not to eat. I think, in today's day and age, everybody's had something to drink before, like water or whatever.
Not me. I'm very makbid on that, but but you're right.
Right, because
the assumption that you haven't eaten or drinking before breakfast, so you're gonna right, exactly. Yep.
But is it
before Shacharis? Yeah.
Your fast for whatever period it is from the period before, meaning like if you're extending your fast.
Yeah.
In the nighttime, you still don't say tomorrow, even though you're
correct. You presumably, even though the fast begins at the day, you have to accept it from before, not just at the night, even though you're still eating at the night, but from the previous day. But again, a lot of this stuff, some of this will get spelled out if as we continue. A lot of it is not fully spelled out, and Tosfos tries to figure it out. The Rishonim try to figure out, but a lot of it remains pretty vague even at the end. Yes.
Question to Rabbi Lorea: Sephardic practice at Marav for Arvit
on a fast that only begins in the day?
Yeah.
I can't imagine that you do
On
that.
a fast that begins in the morning?
Yeah.
Do you say Anenu the night before?
Right.
No.
And how about Tisha B'Av?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So now we say like this. Okay, so now we've identified that the problem here is not that it's not a full day fast, but it hasn't had a Kabbalah. Marukva ikla leginzak. Now Marukva came to this place Ginzak. Bomine, they asked from him, Mitanim l'shaot or in mitanim l'shaot? Can you do a part-day fast or not? Lo aviyade. He didn't know the answer. Would you wait? Kan kanin shel nachrim asurim mutarim. Jugs of non-Jews that they stored stam yenam in, wine of non-Jews in it, but it was cold, and but they were porous because they're pottery. What's their story? Can you use them or not? He didn't have the answer. When Moshe was serving as the Kohen during the Yemei Miluim, right, and he was inducting Aaron and the sons, what clothing did he wear? He didn't have bigdei kahuna. La b'yadeh. I have no idea how these three are connected. I'm sure you can make a brilliant drash to connect these three. Anyway, other v'shal bei midrash. He went and asked in the base medrash. Amrulei, they said to him, Hilchas halachas mitanim l'shaot mitpalel tfilat ta'anit. You can have a part day fast, and you can even say Anenu. Like we said before, that the jugs of the non-Jews after 12 months you can use because whatever wine got absorbed, in the pottery is considered to now be, to not give any more taste, dissolve, which actually, leads to these interesting questions about China after 12 months, etc. The difference here, I should just say, is that this is all cold. This is not with heat. So that's why it's important to note that this discussion is with things that absorbed in cold. Okay. We'll assume he wore a simple white cloak. Rav Kahana Masni b'chaluk lavan she'ein lo imra. He added that there was no there was no cuff to it. There was no stitching, because then this was based on a principle that v'yisim nikim Hashem Yisrael. You don't want to think that you're smuggling some stuff out in your hems. Okay, no hems, right? Amar Rav Chisda. All right. So anyway, that was interesting, but that basically just reinforced the idea that there is this thing called tfilat ta'anit sha'ot, and you would even say anenu. Amar Rav Chisda. Let's get a little further. Hada marta mitanin l'sha'ot v'hu shelo ta'am klum ad ha'erev. So now it's so funny, because there were two possible issues of what made it a Taanit Sha'ot. One is it didn't have a formal Kabbalah. So we said, you need to have a formal Kabbalah the night before. It doesn't count as a Taanit Sha'ot. Now we're saying the other thing that made it Taanit Sha'ot was that you only did it for part of the day. But now we're saying, if you want a Taanit Sha'ot to count, you have to not eat until nightfall, the following night. So you accepted it the previous night, and you're not eating until the following night. So what makes it exactly a Taanit Sha'ot? So that's what the Gemara says. Amalei Abaye. So Abaye said, Ha Tanis Mal Yossi. So that's a full Tanis. It says, no, look, Tzricha, the Imlachim Lucha. You changed your mind, which means, what does it mean you changed your mind? So so one explanation is that you didn't eat breakfast. It was a busy day. You weren't thinking exactly about fasting, and came along the middle of the day and you said, I've already fasted half of the day. I might as well finish the rest of the day and not eat. Okay, and that's so. Yes, you didn't eat the whole day, but it wasn't. But the first part of it wasn't bitani. The problem with that is that we just said a little bit. We said a minute ago that you need to have a Kabbalah me'ikara. So how do you have a Kabbalah me'ikara and then not go and not go to the end of the day? So it's and then still say imlachim luche. So it's very unclear. Rashi says. Lo tzrichina dimlachim luche, about 10 lines down in the near lines. Lo yebedaito klal lihitanot, ela asale tirda, v'lo achal ad chatzi hayom, v'chimat chatzi hayom mimlach amarho v'taniti ad chatzi hayom, et aneh kol hayom. Okay, that's all. So it's exactly as I described. It's all very lovely, but it doesn't exactly explain, the issue of what happened to the idea of the Kabbalah me'ikara. So Tosfos in Avodah Zarah has another explanation of this. I'm trying to remember it a little bit more complicated about how you could get the two parts, where you had the Kabbalah me'ikara, and you still did not. It would not be a full ta'anit.
Then you change your mind and said you were going to eat, and then maybe you never did. You can still say anenu.
Yeah. But if it never counts as a Taanit Sha'ot unless you finish it, right?
You did finish it. Meaning
yes, but it will never count. But the idea that there's such a thing as a Taanit Sha'ot now only works if it was an accident, right? Because under any normal circumstance, if you wanted to work, you'd have to basically do it. You'd have to do it as a full Taanit. I'm not remembering how Tosfos explains it, but it's very hard to see these two Gemaras working together. The easier explanation is that these two are disagreeing, that the previous Gemara assumes that yes, you can do a half-day fast, but it needs a Kabbalah me'ikara, and that's their idea of a Taanit Sha'ot. And this Gemara assumes that you need a full-day fast, but it can count as a Taanit Sha'ot in terms of your intention, that your intention to consider it a fast only began in the middle of the day, did not come from the night before. Is that clear? Meaning there are two possible components that are missing. One is you didn't finish it, and one is you didn't have a Kabbalah me'ikara. The Gemara before said you needed a Kabbalah me'ikara. This Gemara says you need to finish it. You combine them, it's hard to see how it could not be a full Ta'anit. So the easiest way to understand this is that these two sugyot have different ideas of what a Ta'anit Sha'ot are. The previous one assumes a Ta'anit Sha'ot is something that literally you stopped eating at midday. You were mitanet till lunch, and then you started eating. And this assumes a Ta'anit Sha'ot is you fasted the whole day, but the whole day was not done as a Ta'anit. It was only labeled a Ta'anit in the middle of the day. It was not labeled a Taanit from the beginning of the day. Okay, me'ikara. But those two issues are presumably, that's the debate here. Which one can be missing for it to be considered Taanit Sha'ot? Okay, so now the Gemara continues. V'amar Rav Chisda, kol Taanit shelo shaka alav chama lo shmei Taanit. Any Taanit that the sun did not set does not count as a Taanit. You have to, which is basically a way of reinforcing the idea before that you cannot have a Taanit that ends prior to the end of the day, even a Taanit Sha'ot, but it has to go till the end of the day, till sunset. Now, by the way, I should say the language of Shakal of Chama raises an interesting question, which is, so why do we wait till Tseis for the fast days, right? And actually, according to some Rishonim, you don't have to. According to some Rishonim, other than something like Tisha B'Av and obviously Yom Kippur, you can actually start eating Kamishkia. But nevertheless, Tosfos and the Psak has developed that either to read Shakal of Chama, because Tosfos has the idea of two shkiyas, like a second shkia, which is basically closer to Tseis, to either to read it that way or to somehow say that, but somehow say it's not meant literally. It says shkiyat hachama, but it really means nightfall. But it is interesting. On the one hand, this is being framed as a chumrah. It doesn't count as a Taanit if you do it, if you end before nightfall. You have to go till the end of the night. Like we said, even if it's a Taanit sha'ot, it has to go till shkia. It's being framed as a chumrah, but implicit in this is a kula, that you don't have to go beyond shkia. We actually don't paskin that kula. Yes.
I was at the Sheriff Israel Spanish Portuguese synagogue once, and they ended the fast immediately after they got into RV.
Well, was it immediately after shkia?
20 minutes after
about 20.
So that's different. That's an early standard of tzeit.
The earliest moment of
I personally, if you just want to know my own idiosyncrasies, I paskin Rabbeinu Tam for like Shabbos and Yontiv and Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, which is 72 minutes. But when it comes to like the minor fast days, I paskin the Gra, which is like literally it's 13 minutes, but I wait till like 25 minutes. So anyway, so I sort of so all right. I guess it all evens out at the end. All right. Anyway, so the Gemara says like this. Okay, so now we have this idea, again, as opposed to before where it literally could have been a half day, presumably. Here it's a full day, but without Kabbalah. And that counts as a Taanit, or, the labeling it as a Taanit only started in the middle. But here the point is, again, emphasize, but whatever happens, it has to go till Shkiyah. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Meisvei, I'll ask you on this. Ante Mishmar mitanim v'lo mashlimim. So the people of the Mishmar, the Kohanim and the Leviim, that was their cycle, to the Kohanim to work in the Beit HaMikdash that day, and there were also corresponding groups of Leviim and so on. They would fast the day that they would be, they'd be working in the Beis HaMikdash, but they would not go the whole day. So the Gemara says, Hasam. So you see, there's a sense of Taanit without going till the end of the day.
Does Mashlimim mean you make it up? Or
no,
Mashlimim?
Shalem. You do not complete it. So the Gemara says, Hasam. That wasn't an official fast. They were like not eating as a way of depriving themselves, and we'll see when we get to the Gemara why that was, what the idea of that was. But it was a way of expressing some suffering, but it was not exactly a formal Taanit. Okay, Tashma coming here. The Amar Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok, Ani mibnei banav shel San'av or San'a ben Binyamin. So we're going to find later a major focus of this Masechet is these Chagim in Megillat Taanit, these holidays that would you not be able to fast, and particularly ones were associated with days in which they would be, when they returned from the exile in the time of Ezra, families donated wood to the Beis HaMikdash for the Mizbeach. And those days that they made as a particular day of the family to donate wood were established in the future as holidays for that family. And that family would always, in the future, and every future year, even if there was plenty of wood in the Beis HaMikdash for the Mizbeach, that family would make a special holiday and give a gift of wood on that day. And we'll discuss that when we get to it. And part of the relevance is that if that's your holiday, then you don't fast on that day. So here, one of the holidays of San'a ben Binyamin was, or the holiday of San'a ben Binyamin was the 10th of Av. Okay, right after Tisha B'Av. So let's take a look. I am from that family. And Tisha B'Av was on Shabbos. So then we observed Tisha B'Av on Sunday, the 10th. But that was my holiday. And we fasted, but we didn't complete it. It was our Yantiv, so that'll even override Tisha B'Av. So we didn't not observe Tisha B'Av at all, but we didn't complete Tisha B'Av. So you see there that how could he not observe Tisha B'Av? Presumably, even though he didn't complete it, it's still counted as a Taanit, the Gemara assumes. Otherwise, like, why observe it at all? Or otherwise, how could he have overridden it?
I'm sorry, this is way after the Korban?
Yes, it remains a holiday even after the Korban. Okay, Tosfos has this instruction. Batla Megillas Tanis, lo Batla Megillas Tanis. But yes, for him it remained a holiday after the Korban. So the Gemara says no. Hasam Nami Litzui Nafshi Ba'amahu. So a very interesting answer. You know what? Because it was his Yantav, he could have totally overwritten Tisha B'Av. He could have technically eaten the whole day. It was not like he got credit for fasting on Tisha B'Av. If you're not paying go till the end of the day, you don't get credit for fasting. But the reason he didn't eat it, but he didn't need credit for fasting, was his yontiv, and that had the power of overriding Tisha B'Av, which is quite shocking. We'll look at that when we get to it. But the only reason he fasted at the beginning, it's in a way it sort of evoked some of the Gemara we had before about being mar'iv atzmo and the tzibur is sharoi b'tzar. It would be inappropriate for him to be eating on Tisha B'Av. Everybody else is fasting, so he deprived himself. He participated in the affliction. It has a status of afflicting himself, but that's not a Taanit. He didn't have to do it as a Taanit, and therefore he didn't complete it. But he didn't want to just set himself apart from the tzibur either. Yes.
Well, he was able to be Doche Tisha B'Av, but when Tisha B'Av was pushed off to the 10th of Av.
That's a very good point too. Right. It might not necessarily have had the power to be Doche Tisha B'Av Bizmano. It was Doche Nidche. Right. It was a good point. Yes.
This language also goes back to the point of Taanit as being a matter of prayer and not tshuva. Does this suggest that that Taanit is not about suffering? In other words, this was his personal tzar.
Well, right.
But Taanit is something different.
I'm not sure it would go that far. It's just saying that the suffering without the frame of Taanit is just suffering. But like the Gemara before, when it spoke about the idea of is it good to be mitaneh or not to be mitaneh, Yoshev Taanit, the Gemara, if you remember, the top of Yudaf on Bet said, Matzi litzu'urei nafshe hu delo matzi litzu'urei nafshe, talking about whether it's fit to be mitaneh or not mitaneh. So I would disagree with that. I would not say it means Taanit is not about suffering. It means, but when you take away the framing of Taanit, all you're left with is just self-inflicted suffering. Okay?
Yep.
But there's sometimes there's a purpose to that, because you don't want to be indulging when everybody else is sitting in a sitting in a tanis. Okay, so the Gemara says like this.
I was like Moshe.
Right. So exactly like sitting on a rock instead of sitting on a pillow. Exactly. So the Gemara says like this. Tashma coming here. Dam Rabbi Yochanan ehei betanis ad she'avu lebeiti. Rabbi Yochanan would say, now it's very funny. Di amar Rabbi Yochanan. It sounds like Rabbi Yochanan is saying a halachic statement, which is normally how you introduce it. But here it's really saying that Rabbi Yochanan himself would say from time to time, I'll be in a tainis until I get to my house. Like fasting between snacks. Okay, so he was traveling on the road. So you see, it was a ta'anit without the day completing. He said ehei b'ta'anit. So the Gemara says no. Hasam l'shimut einafshe mi bein nesiyahu da'avid. There he did it because he was afraid that the Bein Nesiya's house would sort of demand that he that he'd come for a meal and invite him over. So he says no, I'm in a tainus. I can't join you for the meal. Okay. Okay. It's like the opposite of the line somebody told me the other day. It says 2 questions that the answer is always yes to. One is, have you davened mincha? And the other is, are you milchik? So anyway, so here you wanted though the answer always to be no. Like, no, I'm sorry, I've already eaten, I can't join you. Anyway, all right. So that wasn't a real tanis. Amar Shmuel. Okay? So that again underscored the need to complete. Right, as we said, that probably was ignoring the weight of the need for Kabbalah Mibod Yom, or else what are you left with in terms of Tanit Sha'ot? But here, Shmuel now is going to revisit the importance of Kabbalah Mibod Yom. So let's take a look. Amar Shmuel, Kol Tanit Shelo Kabbalah Mibod Yom Lav Shmei Tanit. Right, so you have Rav Chizah saying if Lo Shakal Lav Chama Lo Shmei Tanit, and Shmuel saying if you were not Mekabel Mibod Yom Lo Shmei Tanit. So again, once you combine these two, it's pretty impossible to figure out how you're ever going to get a Tanit Sha'ot. Okay, so presumably, as we said, Tanit Sha'ot is one or the other. But now we've underscored the need of going till Shki'ah, and now Shmuel is saying the need for Kabbalah Mibe'od Yom. Yasiv Mai. Now let's say you went ahead and you fasted the whole day, but you didn't have a Kabbalah the day before. What is that? What's the significance of that?
We don't.
So Amar Rabbi Bar Shila. Dami lemapucha demal yazika. You are like a bellows filled with air. Basically, you filled your body with air, but it's worthless. You don't get any credit. You didn't do anything meaningful. It doesn't count as a Taanit. You don't say Aneinu. It's nothing. It's a very, very like graphic image. So, Emas makbile, when do you accept it upon yourself? So Rav Amar b'mincha, at mincha, which means by context mincha time, not during mincha itself, because Vishmuel Amar, the same Shmuel who said that you need kibel alav mibod yom, says b'tfilat hamincha, during the prayer of mincha, you actually do it at in the Shmona Esrei. Okay, now that's important because again, going to this issue about the relationship of ta'anit to tefillah, right? If it's just some type of a kabbalah, like some type of a neder, which is an idea we'll see before, why exactly does that belong in Shmona Esrei? Like the idea of doing it in the afternoon because it's before the day begins, right? That makes sense, right? Why it needs mincha time. You might even want to say it's plaga mincha, really close to the end of the day. But why does it need mincha? So again, maybe it's easier to remember if you have a fixed place to do it in. But but people, if you want to accept the Taanit, normally it's a thought that flies through somebody's head. Why don't they just say it? Why do they have to incorporate it into the davening? So presumably, this again shows the relationship of Taanit to tefillah. But we're not done. Yes, Michael.
Sorry, is this only for a personal fast? In other words,
yes, personal fast.
None of us are makabel a public fast the mincha before.
What?
None of us are makabel a public fast the mincha before.
Right. This is all personal fast. Otherwise, because it doesn't say, but that's the whole context of all of this, right? And the Mishnah, remember, still is also about the yichidim, although the second part of the Mishnah is about the tzibur. But yes, this is all about a personal fast. Now, where you accept it also is interesting. If you look at Tosfos, Kol Taanit shelo shak'ah, Tosfos says, the first wide line, he says, Kol Taanit tzarich lekablo mi be'erev b'tfilat hamincha b'shomea tefillah v'im hu Shabbat be'elohai nitzur. Okay, because Shabbat you don't have Shomea Tefillah. Okay, but the fact that you're saying it in Shomea Tefillah, what the heck does your personal Kabbalah to be fast tomorrow have to do with Shomea Tefillah? It's not a prayer you're making to God, right? You're making a personal Kabbalah. So, but the point is, if the purpose of a Taanit is for God to be Shomea Tefillah, if Taanit is connected to Tefillah in a way of having our prayers heard, I think there's a power. Now, again, that we see much more by the Taanit Tzibur, or the Taanit of the Yechidim that's leading into the Taanit Tzibur of this Masechet, that it's about an intensifier of prayer, right? A personal Taanit, maybe it's because we're going to find out later, as you know, major reason they made a Taanit was Taanit Chalom. I have a bad dream. I feel that maybe somehow by doing a Taanit that'll negate the portents of the bad dream, or maybe I'm doing it as just my own personal religious practice. It's not so clear why personal Taanit is connected to Tefillah, the way that the Ta'aniyot of this Masechet are. But nevertheless, it is, significant that we have this connection in Shmuel and in the Tosfos saying that it even occurs in Shomea Tefillah. I should also mention, by the way, the other interesting point about this and about thinking about like Ta'anit Sha'od as opposed to a day of Ta'anit is the fact that you need Miba'od Yom, right? On this one hand, even though the fasting on these minor fasts or on a personal fast begins in the morning, you need the Kabbalah the previous day, right? You need the Kabbalah to be not the night before, but the mincha before, right? Why not? I mean, the night before is still before I'm starting to fast, because we're viewing it not just as a personal practice. I'm accepting on myself to do a practice of not eating. In a way, the personal practice is just called Litzirei Nafshe. I'm not eating. That's what I'm doing. I'm just afflicting myself. A Taanit gives somehow status to not the act that I'm doing, but the thing I did was a fast, and maybe even the day was a Yom Taanit. So to give status to that day, it has to occur even before nightfall, even though the fasting itself won't begin until the morning. Rav Moshe has a fascinating shaila going to historical fasts and communal ones as opposed to personal ones. But do the 3 weeks begin, the night of Shivasar B'Tammuz? Can you go to like a wedding the night of Shivasar B'Tammuz or do something else? So it feels a little inappropriate, but he gets into this interesting question, right, about the fasting, the practice begins in the morning. But the status of the day might begin when the day begins, right, the night before. So the idea that even though the fasting begins in the morning, the Kabbalah has to occur already before, nightfall. Yes.
These sugis are parallel to the sugis in Brachot around page 15, like personal praise at the end of the Amidah.
Yes, although that's right. Tosas is discussing and Shomer Tefillah. Again, that's not in the Gemara, but yes, and again, that raises the question of its relationship to Tefillah. Let's take a look. Amar Rav Yosef says Rav Yosef Kivasei de Shmuel mistavra, like Shmuel makes sense. Tichsiv b'Megillat Taanit, and notice the language Tichsiv, right? It's written, the same type of language you would use if something was in a biblical verse, but that's because Megillat Taanit actually was written and was not part of the oral culture. It was written, and again, this is a short scroll from the time of already going back to Bayit Sheni that had in it a list of the days that you could not fast, a list of the minor holidays. Okay, and it's written in Megillat Ta'anit the following: Lahain, therefore, kol inish yesi aloi mitkadmas dina. Any person that is brought upon himself from prior to this, meaning that accepted upon himself to fast prior to these days, these holidays, yaser, shall be forbidden to fast, meaning these are days that you are not allowed to fast. I'm sorry, shall be forbidden to eat, meaning it gives a list of days you cannot fast, but it says, but if you're accepted a fast upon yourself prior, then you remain forbidden by your Kabbalah. Now, exactly what that means in terms of what do you mean you remain forbidden? Does that mean you remain forbidden if it doesn't contradict one of these holidays? Or that if your Kabbalah preceded these holidays, then you would go ahead and fast even when you encounter these holidays? Okay, we'll bracket that for a minute, but we're just going to focus on the language of yaser, which shall be bound or be forbidden. My love, yaser atzmo bitzalu, shall forbid himself in prayer, meaning that the Kabbalah happens in prayer. So the Gemara says, no, it just means forbid yourself by a Kabbalah, but without prayer. Now, of course, where did you get one diuk over the other? Who cares if it's written with two yuds or written with an aleph? How does one imply in prayer and the other imply not in prayer? So the point here is, it's very hard to argue why one or the other. But this here is the best edition of Megillat Taanit, came out recently from Vered Noam. Very nice, thick, heavy book. Also written very heavy paper anyway. Very heavy book. But just so you have a sense of how small the actual Megillat Taanit is, I mean, a lot of this is like manuscripts and notes and so on. Here's the whole Megillah, okay? Yeah. It's the tiny little text up here, not all this stuff, okay? It says, Atchil Megillat Taanit, okay, which is probably the scribe. Ilin Yomaya Delo Lisana Bahon, here are the days not to fast. Umiktsas Mehon Delo Lemisbet Bahon, and some of these days you can't even give a hesped. And then it says, Min Reish Yarchat Nisana Tamyabe, from Rosh Chodesh Nisan until the 8th, and then it lists dates. Again, look, see, just listing dates, the Arbas, the Abar B'Tamuz, the Esrim V'Arba Bey, right, listing dates, right, this date, gives like 3 words about what happened on each date, okay? It goes on, basically, and the whole thing is 38 short lines. You see, how long the lines are? The whole Megillat Taanit is 38 lines, and then the very last line of Megillat Taanit says, right, it goes through Adar because it starts with Nisan. So be'asrin v'tamna be asas b'seruta tava lihudai delo yudin mina raisa v'lo lemisbeit. So that's the 28th of Adar, and then the very last line of Megillat Taanit says lehain inish di isi aloi asir betzalu. So notice the word it had that wasn't in our Gemara. It's salu, in prayer. Okay, therefore a person that brings this upon himself is forbidden in prayer. Now that's a pretty ambiguous phrase what that means, but the point is this text has the word bitsalu in the text itself. And a number of manuscripts of this Gemara had, when the Gemara actually quoted Megillat Taanit, had Tiksiv Megillat Taanit, Lehein kol inish yesi aloi mikamastina yaser bitzalu, actually had the quote bitzalu in prayer. Okay, and therefore the debate in the Gemara was not how do you interpret the word yaser, but whether your girsa of Megillat Taanit had the word bitzalu or not. Okay, and that was the question. In Megillat Taanit, when it refers to accepting a fast, does it have the word bitzalu in prayer in there, or does it not have that word in there in Megillat Taanit? So either it's a question of interpreting what the word yaser means, but more simply, it was a question of what your girsa of Megillat Taanit was, whether you had the word in prayer or not. So that's is the debate.
Who edited it?
This is Vered Noam. Okay, now a lot of after that short list of dates, what you have is something that already the Bavli knows of and quotes from, which is called the Scolion, the Scolia. It's pronounced Scolia or Scolia, whatever.
Scolion is what I understand.
Right,
It's
right.
singular. I mean,
Yeah.
it's got a singular ending.
Right. Okay. Anyway, so that is the one that really elaborates on what happened in those days, and often that was written later than the original Megillah, and that was written more in the probably like Amoraic period, although some of it actually shows later influence of incorporating things in the Bavli and retrofitting them into it, but it did precede the Amoraim, and often when they quote Megillah Taanit, they're quoting the Scolion, not just the short Megillah, which is just the list of dates. Okay, but anyway, the Gemara says, look, it says in Megillah Taanit, you forbid yourself in prayer. It says, maybe take out the word prayer, maybe that's not what it means. Okay, so Pligi Baha, Rabbi Chiyav, Rabbi Shimon, or Rabbi, there's a debate. Chad Amar Yaser, v'chad Amar Yaser. Again, we're somehow assuming that Yaser means with two yuds, the way our Girsa of the Gemara is. There are very different Girsas of the Gemara, but with our Girsa of the Gemara, it means in prayer, as opposed to Yaser, which just means a simple, make it forbidden on yourself. Mandama Yaser Kedaminan, Lemandama Yaser Mahi, the Tanya Megillah Ta'anit. So now here we said, and we taught. Notice here it moves from Dichsiv to the Tanya. Okay, because now it's quoting the Scolion. So the Scolion is not Dichsiv, it's not the actual, short written scroll itself. It is a later elaboration, and that's seen more as a type of of an oral text, and not as much of a written text. So the Tanya Megillah Ta'anit, we taught in Megillah Ta'anit. Kol inish diyesi aloi mekanas dina yeaser ketzad. So now this is the Scolion that elaborates on what that line means of that you forbid yourself. So yachid shekibel alav sheni v'chamishi shel kol hashana kula. If an individual decided, and this is fascinating, it shows you how far back this idea goes of fasting, right? Not in the context of Ta'anit Tzibur, not in the context of rain, just personal fast. And the Gemara before was reflecting, is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's clear that this was a widespread practice, or at least not a rare practice. So therefore, it says in the Scolion of Megillah Taanit, somebody who accepted upon himself to fast every Monday and Thursday of the entire year, v'irubam yamim tovim haksuvim b'Megillah Taanit, and these yamim tovim come about, im nidro kodem l'gzeratenu, if his vow preceded our gezerah, our decreeing these days as yamim tovim, yibatel nidro et gzeratenu. So his neder overrides our vow, and he fasts on these days. V'im gzeratenu kodemet linidro. However, if our vow, our decreeing these days preceded his vow, so then tibatel gzeratenu et nidro, our gezerah wins out. So that's why it says if he was, again going back to the line that we had before, kol inish diyesi aloi mikadmas dina. If you had accepted upon yourself prior to these dates of the Megillah, then you remain forbidden. If you were there first, you went out. If we were there first, we went out. Now the question is, what does it mean we're there first? So, does it mean that you started fasting before you encountered one of our dates? That will almost always happen. The only exception to that would be you actually began your fasting on the date itself. But then it means anytime the fast began earlier, you always override. So then when is there ever going to be a time, what's the whole point of this Megillah? You're always going to win out. The other one's always going to win out. So basically, Rashi and Tosfos both read this take a look at Tosfos. No, that's a different point. But anyway, both read this as saying that it means that you made your vow before we declared this day a yontif.
Yeah.
So it means that so then it's very rare, meaning that
Right.
as soon as this thing is written down,
It's
the only
historical.
purpose of writing that was for the year in which that thing was being written down. But any year after that, it's all irrelevant because it's already written and these days are already decreed. But it really means that if you had your vow prior to the day, they're basically the phrase we have, you're grandfathered in.
Exactly.
If you had your vow prior to us announcing these new days, you keep your vow. But otherwise, once these days are on the calendar, then you have to give up. Then your vow gets pushed off. Now, what happens to your vow if it encountered one of these days? So then there's a debate of whether you have to make it up on another day. And now we're getting to this idea of being mashlim. If you look at Tosfos, v'im gzerasenu kodem linidro yidched nidro mipnei gzeratenu, omer Rashi yidachen nidro mikol v'kol v'lo yashlim oto ta'anit. Okay, so that if it actually doesn't count, you have an idea of making up. And this is going to be an interesting thing of Taanit. Where else do we have an idea of making up? Tefillah, right. So this becomes very interesting of an idea of that it's something you can make up. But part of it also is, again, because we think of it as a thing, not just as a practice. Like it's not just I am vowing on Thursday I'm not going to eat. Okay, then if I ate on Thursday because it was a yontiv or whatever, I had to, whatever, then I violated my vow or something, but it doesn't mean that Friday replaces Thursday, right? I made a vow about Thursday. But if it's an idea that there's this thing called a Taanit, and I'm going to do 5 Taanits, right? I will pay up, I will sort of do 5 fasts, and there are units of things that I'm doing, so maybe I can do them on a different day, even if it wasn't the day that I was intending of doing it on. So again, there's a certain type of an objectifying, I don't mean that in the way we use it now, but of a reifying, of a creating the fast, not just as a practice, but as a thing, right? And that's, again, going back to the idea of a neder from the day before, making it up, counting how many you're doing, and paying them off on a different day, and so on. Yes.
We have that idea for the public fasts already.
That there's an idea of being nidcheh. Right, the day of observance. But here it's not like it's true, but here there's more of like a flexibility. Well, that is true. Those gets to the question of do you do it the immediate next day or do you have to pay it up eventually and sometime? But you're right. I still think that there's a difference here because there's like the question of which day is Tisha B'Av observed. It's different than the question of I made a neder to do this and now I'm just and I made it to do it on a particular day and I'm going to do it on
Should I assume that this neder was a mistake? Right? Otherwise, it would be like a neder l'shav. Is there such a category?
What do you mean it was a mistake? You mean because it conflicts with a yontif?
Exactly.
Well, that's exactly the point I'm making. If this was just a neder of practice, so then fine. So then maybe it turns out that it was a neder shav, or maybe it turns out you transgressed your neder, right? But the idea that you can still make it up shows that we don't just focus on a neder to do practice X on day Y. That there's like I will pay. It's more like I'm going to give X number of fasts, so I don't give it or I don't pay it up on this day, I pay it up on a different day. But it also raises important questions about the whole use of neder, because neder usually is not about doing something, but neder is about creating a status on something. But that also might be related, because what you are doing is you are creating the status of a day as a Yom Taanit, as opposed to a personal practice. So there's a lot to be unpacked here about how this phenomenon of personal ta'anit and the mechanism with which it operates. Okay, yes. Right, and Nazir makes a neder, is true, but that's about his personal status.
And he makes up if he touches, during that period.
Right, he has to be mashlim, that's true. That's a good point as well.
I thought you could escape this whole thing by assuming that when a person makes a neder, he's doing every Monday and Thursday. But he also knows that Pesach is on Monday.
Right. So that's somehow implicit in the neder is that it's adjusted for. Right. That is true. You could basically say it means like that's already implicit in the neder and to be adjusted accordingly when it interrupts with certain dates. Right. You didn't have Outlook coming on and saying that your recurring event is on your calendar. All right. Moving on. So Tanu Rabbanan, we taught Amatai Ochel B'Shoteh. Until when? Now we're going back to the idea that this is again a minor fast. Maybe we're back to the Mishnah that it's the Yechidim that are fasting, or maybe the Tzibur, but it's the one that you can eat the previous night. So till when can you eat if you've been eating the previous night? So Ad Sheyaleh Amud Shachar, until the morning star, which is halachically when the day begins, about 72 minutes before sunrise. Divrei Rebbe, that's what Rebbe says. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Ad Kros HaGever, until the cock crows. Amar Abaye, I don't know whether that's when that is exactly, but it's after. Amar Abaye, what? It's earlier than the morning star? I think it's generally assumed to be after. Yeah. Amar Abaye, Lo Shanu Lo Shelo Gomer Su'udaso. When is it that you can keep on eating? This is very important, right? That, it's going to be, let's say, Shivasar B'Tammuz or whatever. You go to sleep. Can you set your alarm, wake up at 4 a.m. before Amud Shachar and have breakfast? I sometimes do that, not so often. But anyway, so he says that you can eat until Amud Shachar is only if you didn't finish your meal from the night before. Avol Gamar Su'udato, once you've finished your meal and you benched or whatever, Eino Ochel, then that implicitly shows that you are already beginning your fast. Esrei, the Gemara says, I'll ask you on this. Rava Gamar v'Amad. I'm sorry. Esrei Rava, or Esrei Ba, excuse me. Gamar v'Amad harei ochel. If you finish and your meal and get up from your meal, you can still continue to eat. So it's not like you said. It says no. Hasam kishalo sile. That's when you did not like remove the table, remove the food off the table. You might have benched and got up, but the food's still on the table. But once you clear away the table, then you're locked in. Right. Igad Amr. Right. Igad Amr. Some say Amar Rava lo shano kishalo yashan. Aval yashan eno ochel. Once you've gone to sleep. As long as you haven't slept, you can always go back to be eating. Once you've gone to sleep, it's showing that, okay, you're into the next day already, and now you're bound by it. So, Esvei Abaye asked them this, Yashan v'amar harei ochel. Even if you went to sleep, if you got up, you can continue to eat. Hasam b'mitnam name. That's when you didn't really go to fast sleep. That's when you were dozing. Heichidami mitnam name. What is dozing? So, Amar Rav Ashi, nim below nim. It's like you're asleep, but you're not asleep. Tir below tir, you're awake, but you're not really awake. The karulei va'ani, there's somebody who calls you and you answer. The lo yada durei svara, but you can't say anything of reason, right? You can't say anything. You can't give a reasonable, coherent. You're not coherent. Thank you. If they remind you, mitka, you remember. So somebody calls you, say, so where'd you leave the car keys? Whatever. Did you leave it? Did you leave them there? Yeah, whatever. Anyway, so hopefully by then you're saying the right answer. Anyway, all right. So anyway, but if you go fast asleep, not. But of course, the halacha actually is that if you have in mind that you're not being mekabel the Taanit and you're planning on waking up and you set your alarm, so if you accidentally woke up before Amud HaShachar and you were planning not to, then you can't actually go ahead and eat. But if you set your alarm or you were planning to, or you were thinking, I might wake up, and if I do wake up, I'll eat, then you are allowed. Again, this is quite interesting, right? Because the fasting really only begins in the day. It's only a day fast. But somehow, at a certain stage, once you are done with the eating, that really does somehow begin the Taanit even earlier. Where does that mechanism come in? Where does that come in? That you see that, and again, that shows the idea that to some degree the whole day is a Yom Taanit. Although you're only doing the actual practice of fasting, come the morning, the whole day is labeled a Yom Taanit. So once you are done with your eating is allowed the evening of the Yom HaTanit, but it still is a Yom HaTanit. So therefore, once you're done with your eating and then you move into the normal practices of the day. So again, it shows something about the status of the day. It's not something that just begins in the morning. The whole idea of Suda Hamafsekes, comes from the idea that this is the last Suda you eat, and that then it ends the eating. Okay, so let's go a little bit further. So in an individual that accepts a Taanit, although a Taanit Yachid is one that, as we've been discussing, starts in the day, and the other types of Inuyim are permissible, he says, nevertheless, you should not put on shoes, and presumably do the other Inuyim either. Why? So maybe when he accepted a Taanit, he wasn't clear that he was accepting only a Taanit Yachid. Maybe he was accepting the Taanit Tzibur, and therefore it starts the night. Logically, then it should start the night before, and it should have all these other components to it. Now, again, that is a fascinating idea. How can you accept the Taanit Tzibur? You're a Yachid.
Yeah,
what do you mean?
This whole thing.
Right. What do you mean? I mean, Taanit Tzibur is something that a Tzibur does. So again, what it shows you is that there's this thing, this object called a Taanit Tzibur, and the nature of a Taanit Tzibur, is a type of a fast that starts the night before, that has all these other Inuyim, etc. So you as your Yachid, if you're saying in your davening, because we're supposed to say it in davening, Hareini b'Taanit Tzibur l'machar, rather than saying that that's an absurd thing to say, no, it's like saying, I'll have one of the blue ones instead of one of the yellow ones. I'll take the Taanit Tzibur rather than the Taanit Yachid. It's a type of a thing that you can do, and that is with all these extra Inuyim. So again, it's thingifying, it's reifying, this idea of time. I can add a fancy word and another. Anyway, so but now Charlie is going to say, what do you mean? The earlier Mishnah says that a Taanit Tzibur,
exactly
starts in the day, and you're allowed to do all these things. Yes, that's the beginning. But the first three are lighter. Once we get to like hitting our stride, as we're going to see in the next Mishnah, the full-blown Taanit Tzibur is the night before, no bathing, no shoes, etc. And that's seen as classic Taanit Tzibur. So when Shmuel says, for example, Ein Taanit Tzibur bebavel el Tisha B'Av bilvad, he means the Taanit Tzibur is the full-blown, the night before, the extra Inuyim. So Taanit Tzibur is used as a descriptor for this idea of the full-blown, complete fast. Okay? So we're afraid that that's the one he accepted upon himself. So the Gemara says, "Heichi levid." What should you do to avoid this confusion? Amar Rabbi bar Rav Shela lemahachi. Say the following: Lemachar, and here's the language. Ehei lefanecha b'ta'anit yachid. Say explicitly. Okay, it's interesting, by the way, the word lefanecha. You're saying it in davening, so you're talking. Yeah, presumably either in Shomei Tefillah. The Gemara doesn't say where. It tells us that Shomei Tefillah. But again, it's interesting. It's in davening, so you're addressing God lefanecha. But again, it also gets to, I think, this question of Ta'anit and Tefillah, to be in Ta'anit Lifanecha, like Da Lifnei, Miyata Omeid, like the idea of this sort of way that the observance of the Ta'anit is like standing in prayer. I think that there's some echo there. Amalei Rabbanan Rav Sheshes. So the rabbi said to Rav Sheshes, Haka Chazin and Rabbanan de Mesaymi Mesaynayu v'asu lebei Ta'anisa. We see the rabbinic students are put on their shoes, and they come to an interesting phrase, the house of the Ta'anis, presumably means the shul when we're observing a Ta'anit. Okay, which is bizarre. Apparently, it was a Taanit Tzibur, then therefore it should have been usher to put on shoes. So Ikbid, he got upset. The Amalu, he said to the rabbinic students, Dilma meichel nam yachol. Maybe you're also eating. So what is this? You're putting on shoes during a Tanis. So now we're going to see what it's about. Abaye v'Rava, now that was presumably a Beit Tanis, it means it was a communal Tanis, and they were still putting on shoes. Abaye v'Rava, Maili ki misaymi apansa. Abaye and Rava would come into, presumably again, the shul or something, when they were wearing a pansa, which is some type of a shoe, not a full shoe, maybe it didn't have a full sole or something, but some type of a slipper. Maremer Marzutra, machlefi diyamina l'smal or d'smal liyamina. So they still wanted to wear shoes. Well, it's so funny that shoes are the big deal. To me, eating the night before is the big deal, but maybe this was the most visible. People don't see, maybe they smell, but they don't see if you've bathed. They don't see other things, but they see if you're wearing shoes. So this was the publicly observable aspect of, are you treating this as a Taanit Tzibur? So they wanted to wear shoes, so they did a shinui. They put the right on the left and the left on the right. But we're going to see that normally wouldn't be allowed. The reason about all of these is because they really paskind, there's no Taanit Tzibur, bebavel, like I mentioned before. Rabbanan debei Rav Ashi, nafiki archayu. And the rabbis, the rabbinic students of Rav Ashi's house, they went out like normal, with their shoes on their normal feet. Savri, they held. Ki hadamar Shmuel, like Shmuel says, Ein Taanit Tzibur bebavel ela Tisha B'Av bilvad, which again means not that there's never will be a communal Taanit. It sounds like there was a communal Taanit going on, but it never gets to the weight of what's labeled a Taanit Tzibur, which means starting the night before, not wearing shoes, not bathing, not having sex. Those things, that weight is not in Bavel. Bavel never needs rain to that degree, and therefore even a communal fast never has those things. And that's why these rabbis were wearing shoes, but presumably they passed him that way, but presumably the tzibur wasn't aware of, the practice of the tzibur, really was adopting not to wear shoes, and there was this whole issue about how they were being perceived as not participating. Again, it gets to this yachid v'tzibur. Here the yachid is being more lenient, right? You're acting in a way because you know the halacha, it's all very nice, but you seem to be standing out as separate from the community in terms of its observance of the fast. Okay, so we will continue with this tomorrow. Okay.
Today is mentioned on the Megillah.